Hello and welcome back. In our last videos, we have been following the Hebrew people along the way, all the way from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all the way through the um, captivity in Egypt when they were slaves, through the escape through the Red Sea, 40 years in the wilderness, then crossing into the promised land and conquering it. Then we followed them with all the years that they were under the rule of judges, and then finally under the rule of kings, starting with Saul, then David, and then David's son. And then, after all those years of good and bad kings, little by little, they were warned by the prophets that, listen, if you don't go back to God, you will be um, taken up out of your land. And that happened. They were taken up by the Assyrians. And then later, uh, even the two tribes in the south were taken up by the Babylonians. So if we look at Methuselah right now, we are right. Okay, where are you? We are right about here. Okay, so now we are going to enter in our train and we're going to make a loop, a 70-year loop, which will take us from Jerusalem all the way to Babylon, which is modern day Iraq. And after 70 years, the Hebrew people go back to Jerusalem. So that is the route that our bullet train will now follow. And so what happened during those exiles is that, especially in Jerusalem, the last exiles, all the smart people were taken out, all the top students in the college. And they were taken to the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. And there was one particularly bright young man by the name of Daniel, and he was well favored in the court. There came a time that King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and it scared him. And he called all his wise people into his palace and said, I had a dream, and I need you to tell me what the dream means. And they said, okay, king, well, just tell us your dream, and then we'll explain it. And then the king said, I cannot do that because the dream is no longer with me. Oh, they said, well, tell us your dream and we'll interpret it. And the king said, if you cannot tell me the dream and interpret it, you will all die. Well, our Hebrew friend Daniel, the Jewish boy that was taken out of Jerusalem in captivity, he was able to speak to the king. And he said, O King Nebuchadnezzar, it is true what they say. No one can know what you dreamt except God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He can tell you what you dreamt and he can tell me the interpretation of it. So he asked God, and God told Daniel. And Daniel said, O King Nebuchadnezzar, what you saw was a great image, like a big statue of a man. And the helmet and the head were made out of gold. Then the chest and the arms were made out of silver. Then the mid part, the loins, were made out of bronze. The legs were made out of iron. And the feet were made out of a mixture of clay and iron. And then off to the side of it was a stone that was not hewn by human hands. And the stone smashed the feet of the image, and the whole image collapsed and broke down in small pieces in powder, and the wind blew it away. So that, O king, is your dream. Now, the meaning of this is, king, is that this head of gold, that is you, King Nebuchadnezzar. You are that head of gold in your beautiful, gloriful empire. This is you. However, after you, the kingdom will come into different hands with the silver and then the bronze, different people altogether, then the legs, different people altogether, and none of them will have the glory that you had with your empire. So King Nebuchadnezzar was so thrilled and so happy with this explanation by Daniel that he made Daniel prime minister of Babylon. Now, this is the second time in the Bible that we read about a Jewish man being promoted to prime minister through the interpretation of a dream. The first time, I don't know if you remember it, is way in the book of Genesis, way back about at the knees of of our little friend here. Oh, he's falling down. Um, where Joseph, through the interpretation of dreams, was made prime minister of Egypt. So now when we go back to Daniel being prime minister, there are several other events that happened during those 70 years in Babylon. And you can read that in the book of Daniel. But one of the last things that happened to Daniel was that he was now an old man, and now we had the king was the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. And this man had foolishly asked for all the goblets of gold out of the temple of Jerusalem to be used for a banquet that they had. So they were drinking wine out of sacred goblets. And then all of a sudden, this king saw a hand, fingers writing 4 words on the wall. And we know the expression, the handwriting is on the wall. Well, that came from this event. Nobody knew what the words meant. And one lady said, "Oh, king, I know this old man in the palace. He can interpret dreams and he can interpret this." So they called old Daniel over. And Daniel basically told this king, you should not have used those goblets of gold. Tonight you will die, and the kingdom will fall in the hands of the Medes and the Persians. And that came to pass. In the meantime, when you look at the book of Daniel, in the front first chapters, you have all the things that happened to Daniel. The second half of the book of Daniel are prophecies that he made. And the prophecies that you will read were so incredibly accurate that people way later said, there's no way that Daniel could have written that. That must have been written after the fact. But that's not true. It happened that Daniel, through the word of God, was able to write this down, and it came to pass. And we'll get to that in a little while. In the meantime, now the kingdom was in the hands of the Medes and the Persians. And the Persian king had an empire that was gigantic. It stretched all the way from India through modern day Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, down through Egypt, all the way down into Africa to Ethiopia. A gigantic empire. I heard a pastor say it was the kingdom of Indiopia, which was funny. But anyhow, this king had a beautiful wife. Now, the king also had a party, and he had a banquet for 7 days long. And every day they were drinking wine, and he was getting happier and happier. And at the 7th day, he ordered his wife to come to the banquet and show her beauty to all the people there. The queen answered the king through helpers and said, "No, I will not do this." This, of course, made the king furious, and he banished her out of his sight. Then the wise people said, "Oh, king, you need a new wife. So what we'll do is we'll hold a beauty contest." Okay, so they gathered the most beautiful young ladies out of the whole empire to participate in a beauty contest. And there was one particularly beautiful woman, but she was Jewish, and her name was Hadassah. But nobody knew that she was Jewish. That was a secret that only she knew, and her cousin who raised her as his own daughter. And that cousin's name is Mordecai. Well, you need to read the book of Esther for yourself, but I will tell you that because of Esther being the queen at that time, all the Jews in the entire empire were spared from being massacred and slaughtered. It's a very interesting book, this book of Esther, that you will enjoy reading. So now moving forward, we are at the point where our bullet train is going to make a turn back to Jerusalem, because the next king in Persia is actually the stepchild of Queen Esther. This king said to all the people in his kingdom, those of you who we have taken out of your lands, if you want to, I will let you go back to your own land and build temples there, but please pray for me. Well, you can imagine that there were millions of Jews that had already settled in Persia for all those 70 years. They had built houses and built businesses, and they really weren't that interested in going back to Jerusalem, which was destroyed, devastated. The whole land of Israel was plundered. It was not very good. However, about 50,000 Jews did go back to Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel was actually from the royal line of David. So now, after this exile, somebody in the royal line of David was finally back in Jerusalem again. The other man that came with him was a priest by the name of Joshua. Now, because the kingdom was ruled by the king of Persia, Zerubbabel could not be crowned king. So they instead crowned Joshua the priest, the leader of the Israelites. And from that moment in the Jewish history, Israel was ruled by priests. If we look back at our little friend here, in the beginning, they were led by the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Then they were led by the prophets. Then they were led by the kings. And now we enter in the period of the priests. So they are back in Jerusalem and they're working hard to rebuild the country. And it is a very, very difficult thing to do. People needed to be motivated. Several of the prophets helped them with motivating. And Malachi is actually the last prophet during this time in the Old Testament. So they were given warnings and they were giving encouragements and they were giving more prophecies about what was about to happen. Well, in Jerusalem, the temple was still in bad shape. So after many decades, a man by the name of Ezra was sent to Jerusalem out of Persia. And Zerubbabel was given Ezra was given the task to rebuild the temple. And so he did. And about 10 years later, another man by the name of Nehemiah was instructed to go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So now, with this man Ezra being a priest, Ezra was very detail oriented, and he actually is the one who wrote the book of Chronicles. Now, when you look at the book of Chronicles and you compare it to the book of Kings, you'll see that there is a lot of similarity. And when you read the Bible, you go, what? That's the same. It's the same thing. And this king, his mother was such and such, and he ruled for so many years, and then he slept with his fathers, and this king reigned for so many years, and his mother was. That's the same as in 1 and 2 Kings. But it isn't. What Ezra wanted to do is give all the people who would come back to Israel and to Jerusalem 3 things. He wanted to give them roots. He said, listen, all you Hebrew people, all you Jews, all you Israelites, you have roots going way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all the way through King David, all the way to now. These are your roots. But wait, there is more. You have a king. You have a royal line all the way back from David. The royal line never really left Israel except for those 70 years, but the king, the royal line is back. And thirdly, you have a religion. You have the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, get your acts together, worship your Lord, the God, serve him, and get your country back in shape. Well, it took him a very, very long time. It was very difficult. It was very slow progress, and God was not very happy. And God now went into a silence for 400 years, and that is this portion here. Where are you? The neck. Sorry, I had them backwards. This portion, the neck. Now, through this 400 years of silence, although God didn't speak to the Israelites through prophets, he did work. It was during this time that the prophecies made by Daniel with this image that where all the kingdoms would fall and a new kingdom would take over. Well, that happened. During this 400 years, the Persian empire fell, and now the Egyptians came in. The Egyptian empire fell, and now the Greek came. And then the Greek Empire, under the leadership of Alexander the Great, fell when Alexander died at the age of 31. And the kingdom was then divided in 4 pieces, but it eventually fell. And it made it easier for the Roman Empire to take over now. And that is exactly what God was waiting for the Romans to enter the land. Because the Romans did a few very good things. They built roads all over the empire. And not only did they build roads, they also protected the roads with their armies. They had a common language. So wherever you wanted to go in the Roman Empire, you could speak with one another. So for the Jews, this was great because they could now move all over the Roman Empire and set up businesses and live pretty comfortable lives, even though they were under Roman rule. So this ability to travel was just right for what we later call the spread of the gospel. Okay. Now, something happened again through this neck. What happened through these 400 years is that the prophecies about this royal line of David going all the way through here would go through the neck and would end up here in the head, and we're going to get into the jawbone soon. Okay. The next thing is all these prophecies about the coming of a Messiah would also come through this time frame. The coming of the Messiah. The Messiah is the deliverer. Well, we know now that the Messiah was none other than Jesus Christ. But the people then were expecting the Messiah to be a new King David. They had hoped that the Messiah would deliver them, this time from Roman occupancy. But that was never what God intended. What God intended with the coming of the Messiah was to deliver the people from their sins, not from the Roman army, no, from their sins, so that they could reestablish a relationship with God through the Messiah. And that is what we're going to cover in our next talk, because the coming of the Messiah right here will be an event that changed the course of history forever and ever. Nothing ever like that happened. It is absolutely amazing and of such importance that we will spend a little time on that. We will do that in our next video. So until then, faith comes by hearing, and hearing from the Word of God.